early this morning, they just swept in. The regime just melted away. Bashar Al Assad is reported to have taken off by plane. It looks like from flight tracking radar, his plane took off and headed northwest, and then it seems to have disappeared. Now, there are two versions of what happened to him. One is that he crashed or was shot down, but we don't have any independent sort of corroboration of that. There's what I'm not going to put any money on it, but it's so uncertain at the moment. But the other report is that he's flown to the Russian airbase at Hmeimim in the west of the country, from where he will be flown to Moscow. That seems to me slightly more likely at this stage.
In the past few hours, Syrian rebel forces entered and captured the capital, Damascus, overthrowing the Assad family regime, which has been in power for over 50 years.
Bashar Al Assad is said to have taken a plane to flee the capital. His whereabouts are currently unknown. Let's get the very latest from the Times foreign correspondent, Richard Spencer. Richard, good morning.
Good morning.
What do we know? What is the current situation? I've seen online pictures of coming out of the garage of the palace where the rebels have apparently entered.
No, quite extraordinary scenes, and I have to say, I've been following this war since 2011, and my social media, my friends are calling. They're all extraordinarily excited, and I have to say that includes not just Sunni Muslim friends who the sect that's associated with these rebels that have caused such extraordinary shock throughout the world, but also my Christian Syrian friends, even Alawite friends. Part of that sect that Bashar al-Assad belonged to. Just extraordinary emotional response through the Syrian exile community, of which is so many millions strong, thanks to this regime. What do we know on the ground? The regime just collapsed in Damascus overnight. When everyone was preparing for bed last night, the rebels were on the outskirts of Homs, which is the third city in Syria, and saying, would Homs fight? Wouldn't it fight? But rebels were moving up from Deraa in the south, and early this morning they just swept in. The regime just melted away. Bashar al-Assad is reported to have taken off by plane. It looks like from flight tracking radar, his plane took off and headed northwest, and then it seems to have disappeared. Now, there are two versions of what happened to him. One is that he crashed or was shot down, but we don't have any independent sort of corroboration of that. There's I'm not going to put any money on it, but it's so uncertain at the moment. But the other report is that he's flown to the Russian airbase at Hmeimim in the west of the country, from where he will be flown to Moscow. That seems to me slightly more likely at this stage, but as I say, I'm not going to bet on it. His wife and children are reported to be already in Moscow.
And what is going to happen about that Russian bases, particularly the Tartus naval base on the Mediterranean?
Very good question. Like so many of these questions, a lot depends on whether this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its leader, Abu Mohammed al-Jilani, who was a former envoy to Syria. He's Syrian himself, but he was sent back to Syria originally by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that famous caliph of the Islamic State, but fell out with him. And he has since rebranded himself as a sort of Islamist light, if you like, a sort of Muslim Brotherhood style Islamist. He says that he is open to working with elements of the former regime. He has apparently been in touch with the prime minister, who has stayed in Damascus, and talked to him about sort of maintaining the current sort of apparatus of administration. And organising a soft handover. He has promised to respect respect minorities, to preserve a pluralist Syria, and if that is the case, if he really means that, and if he has the power to enforce that on his supporters, then that suggests he's also pragmatic enough to make practical arrangements with the Russians. The Russians say that their embassy is still occupied in Damascus and safe at the moment. I think most ordinary Syrians and most ordinary rebels would say, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how Russia itself is going to respond to us. But, it would be better not to, poke that sleeping dog, if you like. But that applies not just to the Russians; it applies to everybody. I mean, this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a prescribed terrorist group according to Britain and the United States. Will Britain and the United States and other Western powers agree to work with it if it seizes power in Damascus? Will there be a fight for power in Damascus between different rebel groups? You wouldn't want, as I say, no one's going to put bets on this at this stage, but these are the questions we have to look for. As I say, everyone who is on the ground and talking about these things from the perspective of the rebel groups are all talking pragmatically and with a view to preserving the pluralism in Syria. So there is some reason for hope, but many such hopes have been dashed before in both Syria and the rest of the Middle East.
Richard Spencer, thank you very much indeed. Richard Spencer of The Times there. Of course, we'll keep you informed of developments in Syria throughout the programme, indeed throughout the day here on Times Radio.
The Syrian government has fallen to rebel forces and President Bashar Al Assad appears to have fled Damascus. There have been celebrations on the streets of the capital.
Well, Stephanie Glinsky is a Middle East correspondent in Istanbul.
This doesn't mean it's an easy way forward at all for Syria. Of course, we had the HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, lead this rebel offensive, but we also cannot forget that there are many other groups in Syria. Among them, for example, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which is a designated terrorist organization by the UK, by Turkey, the US, the European Union. We have pockets of ISIS still in Syria. So there are many groups and many groups that are opposing the HTS, have been opposing the government. There's a lot of division in Syria still.
How will the latest developments affect other parts of the Middle East? Here's Zach Anders, a journalist in Tel Aviv.
That we are not really sure where this calculation goes. The problem that is going to present itself right away to the Israelis is likely that you don't know everybody who's a part of the opposition factions. You've got the Free Syrian Army, you've got different elements of groups that have Western support, but then you've got groups that are aligned with Al Qaeda and ISIS that in the more rural areas of the countryside had been commanding authority and been fighting Western forces like the United States, which has about 1,000 troops inside the Syrian countryside. They say they've been actively engaged over the last week and a half with ISIS and IRGC or Iranian aligned forces throughout the country.
Well, joining us now is Dr. H.A. Hellier, a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies in London, who specialise in the Middle East. Good morning to you, Dr. Hellier. I'm interested to know whether you think Syria has a chance to be more stable without Assad, or whether there are concerns for you about what the next few months, few years looks like under a completely new regime.
Thank you for having me on your program. I think the answer is both of those things apply. When it comes to stability, I think something that we all have to remember is that Bashar Al Assad's regime was inherently unstable and contributed to further instability in the country for many, many years now. So it's not a question of whether or not his continuation would have meant a more stable future. On the contrary, I think any stable future for Syria doesn't see Bashar al-Assad in it in the first place. At the same time, I think it's reasonable to be cautious, even while hopeful, about the challenges that face Syria going forward. We've seen some good indications over the past few days. It hasn't been, incredibly chaotic. The regime has fallen. But there will be, of course, remnants and leftovers from that regime. The question is whether or not they will, quote unquote, get with the program or create new instability in the country. That's one big question. Another question is how these different rebel forces, which come from a variety of perspectives, and were also joined by huge numbers of other Syrians over the past few days, how they will move forward. But I think that this is intrinsically a Syrian story. The Assad regime isn't a decade or 2 decades old. We're talking 5 or 6 decades by now.
Yeah.
Not just Bashar al Assad himself, but also his father. And the scenes that you would have seen over the past few days of prisons opening up and political prisoners being released, to the point where people who were in prison during Hafiz al-Assad's time and didn't even know that Bashar al-Assad had become president. That's how long they were in jail for political crimes, not for, or rather political offenses, not for actual violent crimes. So the future for a sustainable, secure, and stable Syria, I think meant that Bashar al-Assad had to go. The question now is how Syrians come together and face the challenges of building anew against that backdrop. And I think there's good reason to believe that they'll be able to do it, but I think that they're going to need support, and I hope that the region and the world will give it to them.
Look, we've just been hearing again from the Syrian rebel coalition that you talk of, managed to topple Assad's regime. It's said the revolution has broken decades of tyranny and oppression. And it's billed a great new birth, or a new birth for Great Syria. The understanding is they're now going to work on completing the transfer of power to a transitional governing body with full executive powers. Let's talk through that, because another guest of ours, our Middle East correspondent, was talking about the dwindling amount of funds available in terms of public spending in Syria. He said that there were allegations that President Assad, or former President Assad, had directed state funds to his own accounts.
It's so great to hear you say former President Assad, by the way.
Well, it's true, isn't it?
And I hope your listeners understand this point, that the Arab revolutionary uprisings began in towards the end of 2010, beginning of 2011. And these were expressions of normal, everyday people simply wanting to have a better future for their children, and the ability to have some sort of say in who ruled them. Okay. And I think that that's why you see incredible euphoria across Syria today, but also outside of Syria. I'm at a conference in Qatar at the moment. And I saw a Syrian today. I didn't know him, but I knew the news, and I said, congratulations. And he said he was trying to, take in the news, but he also said, we hope for Palestine, and we hope for Sudan, and we hope for all the Arabs that want to have a better future for themselves and their children. A very natural, heartfelt sentiment. So I think that that's important to sort of center in the story, and at the same time address the problems that you noted. In terms of the financial and economic challenges that Syria is going to necessarily face going forward. And that's why I say I hope that the region and the world step up and try to find as much assistance in order to get Syrians on their feet.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about a rebel coalition here. Some of those rebel groups are aligned with Al Qaeda, ISIS. There's the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the Free Syrian Army.
So I just want to correct something
Go
here.
on.
So in terms of the rebel coalition and Al Qaeda and ISIS, the rebel coalition that you mentioned fought Al Qaeda and ISIS. They're not aligned with Al Qaeda and ISIS.
Well, certainly in the case of HTS, they are a former branch of Al Qaeda, and even though their leader,
which they broke away from,
Yes.
and then fought against in order to make sure that its power ended in Syria.
So can we be confident then that the splinters of Al Qaeda and ISIS will not be peppering this new rebel coalition? Because that surely will be a concern.
So I'm a security expert. I'm very concerned about any type of security threat and extremism threat that's going to come up again in Syria. This is not something that I'm going to put away as a note of consideration. But here's what we've got. We've got HTS, which people should be cautious about HTS. People should not be naive about HTS. This is not what I hope anybody comes away with. But we also have a reality that HTS not only broke away, but fought against. Okay, so I think that that's good news. But we also have something else, that over the past week, it hasn't just been HTS, that's one. It's been, quite a large coalitions of different types of groups, but also Syrians writ large have joined in this toppling of the regime. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these different groups are going to proceed going forward when they don't just have to answer to their own people, their own members in these groups. They're going to have to deal with communities across the country. And something very interesting that I've seen over the last few days is how the rebels negotiated with communities that had nothing to do with them, Christian communities, Druze communities, Ismaili communities, in order to ensure that villages and towns and cities were sort of were splintered off away from the regime. In a fashion that didn't lead to utter chaos and bloodshed. And they managed to do that. So that's all good news. Again, people shouldn't be naive.
Yeah.
They should be cautious. They should take concern. But I think that we should also try to see the ways forward where we can do this, or rather where they can do this and where we can help.
Yeah. Actors around the world. So what other countries, what other leaders will be getting involved in this? Will they have any involvement in this as a transfer of power, a transitional governing body is worked out in Syria?
So I think, of course, regional powers are the ones that are most impacted by the consequences in Syria and should be invested as much as possible in trying to make sure that there's a sustainable transitional period that comes into something that's far more productive and fruitful for the long term. So I think it's inevitable that you're going to see the Turks get involved. You're going to see probably other GCC countries as well. I imagine the Russians are going to try to get involved. And as far as I know, the Russians still haven't completely withdrawn from the coast. The Iranians seem to have. The Iranians seem to have basically cut and run. But as far as we know, that hasn't happened as of yet when it comes to the Russians. And remember, this isn't completely over. There's still the issue of bases and places on the coastline, especially Latakia and Tartus, where things are still not quite settled. But it is game over. It's a question of how the transitional period will now develop. But beyond the region. I think it's in all of our interests within Europe, but also more widely in the international community, that Syria become more sustainable, more stable, but in a real way. And I think that the mistake over the past decade was to say, well, Assad might not be a great guy, but he's stable and he'll hold it together. Well, he wasn't stable and he couldn't hold it together. And I think this is a good lesson for people. Unfortunately, a lesson that hasn't been learned in other places. You can't have these problems under the surface just boil up and boil up and boil up and just put a lid on them. You've got to figure out a way to actually address the real justifiable grievances in order to move forward.
Dr. H.A. Hellier, thank you for speaking to us, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies.